darling," called Nastia from the next room. Pavel replied, "What's the matter?" Anastasia hesitated for a moment before replying, "Do you mind if my old friend stays with us for a few days?" Pavel appeared in the kitchen doorway, hastily tightening his belt. Confused, he asked, "What old friend?" "Don't you remember?" replied Anastasia perplexedly. "I've already mentioned to you my school friend Misha. He came to visit once, but stayed at his friend's house because we didn't have room. Now he needs to return to our town, but he has nowhere to stay, so he asked if he could stay with us." Serving porridge on the table, Anastasia continued, "Hotels are expensive, and it's only for a few days. Besides, he's an old friend. Trust me, you'll like him." Paul slowly sat down to eat, immersed in thought. It seemed strange to him that his wife had taken such an initiative and that it had come as a surprise to him. "When is he coming?" asked Paul at last. "Tomorrow morning," replied Anastasia. "What's, so soon? Why didn't you say so sooner?" exclaimed Pavel indignantly. "He called me just yesterday and asked if he could stay. I told him I would ask you and call him back. So I need your final decision," Anastasia explained. Paul sighed heavily and, lowering his gaze to his plate, replied sternly, "If it's only for a couple of days, then let him stay. Nastia, I apologize for not finishing it. I've lost my appetite, and I'm late for work. I'll hurry up." Pavel got up from the table, gave his wife a quick kiss on the cheek, and started to put on his shoes. "All right, thank you," Anastasia replied, trying to hide her joy. "Take care," exclaimed Pavel, running out of the house. "Oh, wait, your papers," shouted Anastasia after him. "Oh, yes, thank you. See you tonight," replied Pavel and disappeared. The young couple had lived in the house of Pavel's late parents, which they had inherited, for a little less than a year. They met as students and dated for several years. A year ago, after graduation, Paul proposed to Anastasia, and they were happily married. Life went its way, and Pavel had to look for a job. However, it is quite difficult to find a decent profession nowadays, even with a higher education. So not thinking long, Pavel took a temporary job at the factory, continuing his search for a more stable position. He returned home late at night, earning very little, often had to sacrifice various things, and Anastasia also had to work. Although she did not have a higher education, she managed to get a job as a clothes seller in a shopping center, which improved their situation a little, though not much. Alarmed, Pavel hurried out of the house. He could not remember who Misha was or why Anastasia was so interested in his visit. At first, Pavel regretted having agreed to this, but after thinking about it and realizing that it was only for a couple of days, he calmed down. Besides, he trusted his wife completely and did not doubt her or her words. Perhaps Anastasia didn't insist on it at all. She just agreed to help, and we have this opportunity, Paul thought, and continued on his way, forgetting about his worries. When Pavel left, Anastasia closed the door behind him and couldn't help but smile. She immediately dialed Mikhail's number to inform him of Pavel's agreement. "Hi, Misha, how are you doing?" "I talked to Pasha and he agreed," Anastasia greeted cheerfully. "Hi, Nastia," Mikhail replied cheerfully. "This is wonderful news." "Thank you very much. I will come tomorrow morning. Will you be home?" "I'll be home and Pasha is at work. It's Tuesday. Didn't you say you were coming for a couple or 3 days?" Misha confirmed. Yes, exactly as I said." "I won't be delayed," Mikhail assured her. "That's absolutely fine. See you tomorrow then," replied Anastasia cheerfully. "Goodbye, see you tomorrow," said Mikhail, and they ended the conversation. Nastia had been diligently tidying up all morning so that everything would be in order when the guests arrived. She managed to make everything shiny and clean, except for the more technical household chores, such as fixing the nightstand and the faucet. As a result, she felt accomplished, but at the same time realized that she still had unfinished business. Nevertheless, she spent a lot of time arranging the household items, trying to find the best places for them. By noon, everything was ready, and Nastia went to work. In the evening, she enthusiastically began to prepare dinner, wanting to surprise her husband with something unusual. Time flew by, and Nastya did not expect Pavel to return from work so soon. "Nastya, I'm home," exclaimed Pavel, entering the house. "Mom, it smells so good. Have you decided to treat me?" "Hello, darling," Nastya greeted him cheerfully, kissing him warmly. "Yes, you look tired and I wanted to make something special for you." "It's my pleasure." "Thank you," Paul thanked her. "Wow, everything looks so clean. Did you work today?" "Of course, how could I not? It's Monday and you know I have work to do. I just wonder how you find the time to do everything," Paul reflected. "I left work early and didn't waste any time," Nastya replied. "You are my angel. What would I do without you?" said Paul, walking into the kitchen and gently hugging his wife. "Come on, sit down to eat. You must be hungry," Nastya suggested thoughtfully. "With pleasure." "I'll just wash my hands," Pavel replied. Pavel sat down at the table with appetite, rubbing his hands together. "Aren't you going to eat?" he asked. "I've already eaten, and there's plenty of time. I don't eat at night," Nastya explained, standing at the sink. "Well then, come sit with me." "I've missed you," Pavel insisted. Nastya obediently sat down at the table across from Pavel, putting her hands under her head and keeping her eyes on her husband. "Misha will arrive tomorrow morning around 7, she said suddenly. Pavel choked and looked sternly at his wife. He had an immediate suspicion about the unusually clean house and the delicious dinner. "I completely forgot," he replied disappointedly. "That's all right. You were just tired. That's why I reminded you. Now go and eat," Nastya said with a smile, gesturing to his plate. Pavel didn't answer anything. He slowly began to eat, but without the same enthusiasm. On Tuesday morning, Pavel woke up and found that Nastya was not in bed. He decided that she was probably in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. After washing up, he went to the kitchen to greet his wife, but was surprised to see her. "Wow, already putting on makeup and getting dressed?" "Good morning," exclaimed Paul. "Good morning, dear," replied Nastya, kissing her husband. "Yes, I'm going to the store soon." "I see," replied Pavel, feigning indifference. "Sit down and eat. I made plenty yesterday, so there's no need to cook porridge," Nastya suggested. Pavel had just had time to sit down when the doorbell rang. Nastya quickly wiped her hands and hurried to open the door. "Mishka, hello, come in," she greeted enthusiastically. "Hello, hello, Nastya," replied Mikhail warmly, hugging her after a long separation. Paul slowly stood up and made his way to the hallway, which adjoined the kitchen. When he came out of it, he found himself face to face with a tall, elegant, athletically built man. For a moment, Paul felt a little awkward. Nevertheless, he smiled welcomingly and extended his hand. "I am Pavel," the young man introduced himself. "Greetings to you. I am Mikhail. I wish to express my deep gratitude to you for agreeing to shelter me. As a token of appreciation, please accept this humble gift," Mikhail said, and dutifully handed Nastya a small box wrapped in gift paper. "Misha, you shouldn't have," Nastya blushed. "Thank you very much. Come on in. Why are you standing in the doorway? Are you hungry?" "To be honest, I wouldn't mind a meal." "I'm as hungry as a wolf," replied the guest, taking off his shoes. "Come into the kitchen, Paul, and have a seat. I'll be right there," Nastya called from the room where she had gone out to put away the present. Pavel silently made his way to the kitchen and began to eat his breakfast. Mikhail followed his example and sat down in a chair. "Pash, I hope you don't mind if I call you Pash," the guest said confidently, looking straight into the eyes of the master of the house. "No," Paul replied, feeling awkward and hardly taking his eyes off his plate. "Wonderful. I assume you're in a hurry to get to work?" inquired Mikhail. "Yes," replied Pavel. Nastya walked into the kitchen and helped her husband into the kitchen. "So are you two getting acquainted already?" the woman asked cheerfully. "Yes, but Pavel is in a hurry to work, so I hope we'll continue getting acquainted in the evening," Mikhail replied in a friendly manner. "Of course we will continue. Are you working until 9 o'clock again today?" the woman asked her husband. "I'm not sure. Maybe they'll let me off early." "Thanks, I have to go," the husband said and quickly left, forgetting to kiss his wife. Paul felt relieved as he left the house. Michael's outward superiority had a strong effect on him, and being in his presence was hard and uncomfortable. "Misha, please sit down and eat while I go to work. Then I'll stop by the store and come back. Don't get bored," Anastasia said, standing at the hallway mirror. "Are you working too?" Michael asked. "Of course," she replied. "Where?" he asked, apologizing for the intrusive question. "I work in a clothing store in a shopping center. It's a convenient schedule and there's plenty of money," she explained. "Isn't Pavel's salary enough?" Michael asked. He couldn't find a good job after university, so he works at the factory. But he's trying, looking for something better. It just hasn't worked out yet. Everywhere they ask for experience. Nastia defended her husband. "I see. Maybe I'll help you with money," Michael suggested. No, we have enough, thank you." "Well, I have to go now. See you tonight. Make yourselves at home," Nastia said. "Thank you. See you tonight," replied Michael. Michael ate leisurely and then went to look around the house. He admired the cleanliness and neatness that Nastia had maintained. He inspected every room, including the bathroom and toilet, and only then settled down on the couch, unsure of what to do next. During the inspection, Michael noticed a loose door, a broken faucet, and a few other minor flaws that Pavel did not pay attention to. Taking matters into his own hands, Michael confidently entered the bathroom, rummaged through the cabinets and found tools. "I'll fix it while they're not home," he thought, and began to repair. Since he could work with his hands, each task took very little time. However, all the accumulated work took several hours. Just as Michael finished, Nastia came home, followed by Pavel, who had arrived earlier than usual. "So what have you been up to?" asked Nastia curiously to Michael. "Various small things," Michael replied smugly. "Good, and Paul is already here," Nastia said as she took off her shoes and turned to Paul. "Are you feeling okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired from work and hungry," Pavel replied. "I just bought wine and food. Let's drink to your acquaintance," suggested Nastia. "With pleasure," replied Michael, joining Nastia in the hallway. An hour later, everyone was sitting at the prepared table. "I'd like to make a toast." Michael stood up, shifting his gaze from Pavel to Nastia. "Thank you again for providing me with shelter. Your help has been indispensable, and I am truly grateful. I have known Nastia for a long time, since her school days, and I am truly glad she has found a loving family. Pavel, I don't know you very well yet, but I am almost sure that only a decent, caring, and hardworking person can be next to Nastia. I hope that we will get to know each other better and become good friends. That's why I want to raise a glass to you both, to Pavel and Nastia. May everything in your life be wonderful. Here's to you," concluded Michael, raising his glass and emptying it. Nastia sat up straight, completely engrossed in her conversation with her friend. She maintained eye contact and smiled warmly. Pavel's irritation grew as he shifted his gaze from Michael to Anastasia. Despite his irritation, he thanked Michael and then took a sip of wine. "Mish," Pavel began, "I noticed that you fixed the faucet. I'm grateful to you, but I could have done it myself." "Nonsense. It's nothing," replied Michael. "I had nothing to do, and I was glad to help. Besides, Nastia said you were very busy with work. I wanted to show my gratitude by doing something nice." Anastasia couldn't contain her happiness. "You fixed the faucet. Thank you so much, Mish," she exclaimed. "Pash, well, at least you say thank you to him." "I already did." "Thank you," repeated Pavel, nodding toward Michael, and silently continued eating. Silence hung in the air as everyone ate. Pavel did not react to what was happening, concentrating solely on his plate. Nastia ate small bites, watching the others. Michael felt a little awkward, struggling to find something to say. He chewed continuously, searching for words to break the silence. After a few minutes, Nastia's patience broke. "Mish, if it's not too personal, tell me where you're working now and what brought you here," she inquired. "Sure, I'd love to," Michael replied. wiping his mouth with a napkin. A year ago, I opened a small car service center. I've always had a passion for cars, and now I can enjoy my hobby while earning an income. Although the fervor has died down a bit since it turned into a profession, a hobby requires passion and desire. However, I have employees who do most of the work. Sometimes I join them and enjoy the work. I came to your city to meet with my supplier and resolve a few minor issues. And of course, I wanted to see you, Nastia, and meet Pasha. That's all. Pavel was becoming increasingly frustrated with his wife's behavior. She was still fixated on Mikhail, rarely taking her eyes off him and smiling warmly. From time to time, she glanced at Pavel, who sat frowning and pretended not to listen. In response, she cast a stern glance at him and turned to her guest again. That day, she made every effort to look gorgeous and captivating, which she always succeeded in doing. Paul often caught himself looking at her and noticed a disturbing glint in her eyes, which only fueled his displeasure. He had the distinct impression that Anastasia was trying to please Mikhail as much as possible. He knew that Nastia always tried to please everyone and to please her own ego. But this time there was a glint in her eyes that was atypical for such situations, undoubtedly caused by Mikhail's presence. However, Paul did not notice anything remarkable in the guest's behavior except for a certain peacock flair with which he proudly displayed his charm and charisma. Paul felt jealousy and tried to conceal it by adopting an indifferent expression. He had not been jealous of his wife for a long time because he trusted her infinitely. Therefore, he scolded himself for these feelings and tried to push away the preconceived thoughts. However, the feeling became more and more hurtful. "Pasha, may I ask where your parents are and what they do?" inquired Mikhail, shaking Paul's composure. The question completely flustered and irritated the master of the house. "Perhaps some other time." "Thank you very much, Nastia," said Pavel, rising from his chair. "I apologize that I can no longer keep you company. I'm very sleepy, so I'm going to bed." "Sleep how?" The wife wondered. "You've only been sitting here for a few minutes and already you're leaving? That's not very polite." "I understand all that, but I can't take it anymore. Otherwise, I'll just fall asleep at the table. So I apologize." Paul stood his ground and headed for the bedroom. Anastasia frowned, annoyed that she couldn't enjoy the cozy company. "It's all right," Mikhail said, trying to comfort her a little while later. "It's understandable. A man who works 12 hours a day needs a good rest. Maybe you should go to Pasha's so he won't be alone." "I understand, but you could stay late. Did I cook and set the table for nothing?" said Anastasia with annoyance in her voice. "No, I actually wanted to stay longer." Mikhail smiled warmly and looked affectionately at Nastia. Mikhail noticed the spark in Anastasia's eyes, which Pavel noticed as well. However, he wasn't sure if it showed or not, so he continued to act the same way without paying attention to it. He and Nastia had a relationship back in high school, which she never told Pavel about. After graduating from high school, they broke up, deciding that it was for the best. Although they periodically kept in touch, remaining pleasant to each other, it was difficult for both of them to maintain such communication, because deep down they still kept feelings that they refused to admit even to themselves. After a while, Nastia met Pavel and practically forgot about Mikhail. They called only on major holidays to exchange congratulations. Thanks to these short conversations, Mikhail was able to get a glimpse into Anastasia's life. "Well, we can sit for a while longer, and then I'll have the couch in the hallway ready for you," Anastasia said thoughtfully. "Thank you." Mikhail thanked her. "Only Mish, please don't ask him any more about his parents. They died not so long ago, and it's a very sore subject for Pasha. He's in a lot of pain, and such questions will only open up the wound," Anastasia warned. "Oh shit, I didn't think of that when I asked." "I'm sorry," Mikhail apologized sincerely. "You've changed a lot." Anastasia spoke softly, changing the topic of conversation. "Yes, it's been a long time since we last saw each other. You are still as beautiful as before, although there are notes of fatigue on your face," Mikhail replied, no longer doubting that there was emotion between them. "There are more worries now than before." Anastasia smiled shyly. "Mish, I'm sorry, but I have to go. I can't leave Pasha alone. He's very tired. I'll clean up tomorrow. Oh, and now I'll put up the sofa, said Nastya, afraid to continue the conversation, and went out from behind the table. Of course, Mikhail replied, feeling annoyed. He took a deep breath and poured himself another glass of wine. Pavel was awake, lying on his back with his hands behind his head and sunk into thought, looking up at the ceiling. Anastasia entered the bedroom and asked if he was still awake. He answered in the negative, admitting that he couldn't sleep. Wondering if she had done something to upset him, Anastasia squatted on the bed. "Why did he come?" asked Paul annoyingly. "He said he wanted to meet the supplier," Anastasia replied. "But I still don't understand why he came to us, or rather, it seems, to you. He could well have stayed in a hotel, given the luxury car parked outside our house." Pavel resented him. "You immediately brightened up, glowed," replied Paul. "How can you say that, Pash? Do you even hear yourself?" resented Anastasia. "And why shouldn't I? Isn't it true? And it's not me who should be ashamed, but you for your actions." Pavel sharply called out to his wife. "What deeds? Calm down. And why are you talking so loudly? Misha might hear and be embarrassed. Your jealousy woke up for no reason, and I don't want to entertain these senseless conversations," said Anastasia, trying to diffuse the tense situation. "That's exactly right. You're afraid that Misha will hear." Pavel's voice got louder. "Pash, please calm down. What are you so excited about?" began Anastasia in a soothing tone. "You know it's all nonsense." "I love you," she said, raised herself up on her elbow, stroked Pavel's cheek, and kissed him. "I'm sorry." Paul apologized after a few seconds and returned to his previous position. "I just miss you so much. I feel like I hardly ever see you. I know it's my fault, but I have no other choice. But I have faith, and I know that things will change soon. I promise you," he softened, kissing Anastasia again. "I understand, Pash, I do, and I believe too that things will get better. You just need to be patient a little longer," Anastasia said, trying to reassure her husband, though she herself had little faith in a happy future. They lay in silence, each of them feeling a lingering uneasiness. Paul had made similar promises before, but nothing had changed in a long time. The bliss they had experienced when they began to live together seemed a distant memory. The cares and troubles of life came upon them, overshadowing their former happiness. Nastya always tried to support her husband, hiding her fatigue and deep dissatisfaction. She realized that Paul was tired at work and could not give her proper attention. In addition to his work, Nastya had to do cooking and household chores. The idea that this routine would continue indefinitely frightened her, and over time she stopped imagining a happy future with Pavel. Thoughts and dreams accumulated, adding to the heaviness of her heart. Nastya sadly realized that the warm and joyful feelings she had for Paul were fading. She constantly tried to convince herself that it was just moral fatigue and lack of attention, and that soon everything would change, as Pavel had promised. In moments of good mood, she managed to cheer herself up and believe in these assurances, but it did not last long. When she was left alone at home, she was paralyzed with longing, but she was exhausted by her household chores and work. Paul became increasingly disturbed by his wife's lack of attention. He tried to support her and paint a picture of a happy future, but work took all the energy and time. Although there were occasional moments of tenderness and affection, they were too rare to matter much. Returning from work, Paul often found his wife tired and upset, which bothered him very much. After a long day at work, he longed for the warm embrace of a joyful wife, but things were not working out as he had hoped. He realized that it was his fault and no one else's, which made him suspicious of Anastasia's growing bond with Michael. Meanwhile, Mikhail lay on the couch in the evening, listening to the argument between the couple with pleasure. He was pleased to know that their relationship was not going well, and he believed that with enough effort, he could destabilize it further. He had originally come to Anastasia simply curious about her life, but the way she looked at him at the table had rekindled old feelings in him. The same strong emotions he had felt for her in his youth resurfaced, completely consuming Michael. The only obstacle in his way was Pavel. 3 days had passed since Michael had arrived at the couple's home. He had taken care of all the necessary chores that required his attention, but decided to stay for another reason. On Friday, the fourth day, when Paul was at work, Michael approached Anastasia with a request. "I apologize, Nastia, but I haven't managed to get everything done in such a short time. So unfortunately, I have to ask if I can stay with you for a few more days." Anastasia, knowing that Paul was uncomfortable with Michael staying in their home, found it difficult to answer. No, that's too impertinent of me. "I apologize for embarrassing you," Michael said. "Mish, don't worry. You can stay and I'll talk to Pavel. I'm sure he'll agree and won't mind," Nastia replied affectionately. She wanted the young man to stay for a few more days. In the evening, Michael left home for a while. Pavel came from work and did not see the guest, which pleased him. "Hello, Nastia. Has Michael left already?" excitedly asked her husband. "Hello, dear," said Nastia, kissing her husband. "Go to the kitchen and I'll come and tell you." "Okay, are you going to eat?" No, I'm not hungry," Nastia shouted from the bathroom. Hungry and tired, Pavel sat down at the table and started eating. A minute later, his wife walked in. "Listen, Misha asked that he stay a few more days because he doesn't have enough time to sort out his affairs," Nastia said, taking a seat next to her husband. Pavel's cheerfulness instantly disappeared and his face became disgruntled. "What the hell? We agreed on 3 days. That's the way it should be. No, period." "I know, darling, but you have to understand him. He's not inconveniencing us. He even helps around the house." "No, please speak for yourself. He may not be an inconvenience to you, but he is to me, and I am totally against him staying with us." "Pash, I apologize, but I've already informed him that he can stay," Anastasia admitted guiltily. "What do you mean? Do you mean you let him stay without consulting me?" asked Pavel indignantly. "He didn't ask until this afternoon when you were at work. I couldn't consult you," Anastasia explained. "Nastia, you could have called or texted me. I would have taken a minute to reply. That's first of all. And secondly, why did you have to give him an answer right away? You could have waited a little longer." Apathetically, Paul replied and continued eating. "Pash, why are you so testy? Again, you thought up some nonsense and put it into your head." "I love you," Anastasia said affectionately, getting up from the chair and gently hugging her husband from behind. "He lives here and doesn't get in the way, and we're at work during the day anyway. What's more, he even leaves money for food. More than he needs, in fact. Nastia, I understand everything except one thing. Why do you want him to stay with us for a few more days?" said Pavel already more gently. "And what makes you think I want that?" asked Anastasia, continuing to hug Pavel. "I just stepped into the situation and wanted to help. If it had been someone else in his place, I would have done the same thing. I know I'm guilty of a hasty response. I'm sorry, but if you don't mind him staying a couple or 3 more days, okay." Anastasia managed to persuade her husband by hugging and caressing him gently. "Let him stay, damn it. But not for long, or I'll kick him out myself." Pavel finally agreed. Sure, Anastasia replied, holding back her joy. Anastasia informed Michael that she had spoken to her husband and he could stay with them for a few more days. During his stay with the couple, Misha imperceptibly, without her husband's knowledge, won more and more sympathy from Anastasia. He skillfully shared stories about his career successes, but not excessively. Free time they spent together, doing household chores. Michael had a wonderful sense of humor, which constantly kept Anastasia in a cheerful mood. With his charm and charisma, he gradually and quickly won the girl's heart. Nastia unconsciously felt herself growing more and more attached to Michael, looking forward to the moment when Pavel went to work and they could be together again. At first, she felt shame and guilt, but soon these feelings receded into the background, becoming less and less noticeable. Every day her disgust for Paul grew stronger. He seemed to her more and more ordinary, boring, and uninteresting. The mere thought or glance at him evoked feelings of monotony, longing, and even hatred. However, Nastia was determined not to give in to these new feelings. As time passed, She grew more and more afraid that these stolen moments would inevitably end, and she would return to a routine and ordinary life with Pavel. Every morning and evening, she waged an internal struggle to portray herself as Paul's loving and energetic wife. In this charade, it was important to find a delicate balance, not too cheerful so as not to arouse suspicion, but also not too aloof so as not to betray her true feelings of disgust. Nastya managed to find that middle ground. Mikhail noticed this pretense and enjoyed it. However, he could not ignore the fact that she was not morally prepared to push her husband away. Pavel was increasingly becoming in his eyes an obstacle to overcome. Mikhail realized that what was happening between him and Nastya had no future. His plan was to temporarily win her over and then disappear without a trace. On the weekend, Pavel started working for the first time, which seemed unusual to Nastya. However, she did not inquire further, for his absence gave her the opportunity to spend time with Mikhail. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Mikhail became more involved in Nastya's life. Saturday morning, Mikhail went outside to make a phone call, assuring Nastya that he would be back soon. "Grisha, hi, can you talk?" he said when Grigory picked up the phone. "Hi, Misha, since you answered." "I hope you haven't forgotten about the debt?" asked Mikhail. "That's insulting. We agreed on a longer repayment period," replied Grigory. "I remember, but I have a suggestion for you," said Mikhail. "If you honor it, we'll consider ourselves even." Interesting. What kind of offer?" inquired Grigory. "It's not something we can discuss over the phone. Can you meet with me?" "I can." "How about we meet at the diner in half an hour?" suggested Mikhail. "Okay," Grigory agreed. "See you then." Deal. Grigory was an old friend of Mikhail's. Back in their younger days, they kept in touch, solved problems together, and helped each other. Arriving at the diner, Mikhail found a somber young man on the veranda. Despite his age, he looked much older than his years, and his appearance was unpleasant and distrustful. Mikhail walked over, said hello to Grigory, and sat down across from him. "Well, let's get right down to business," Mikhail said. "Yes, I guess so," Grigory replied. "I'm listening to you. Long story short, I need you to make sure one person doesn't go home tomorrow," Mikhail explained. "No way, I'm not getting involved in something like that," Grigory quickly brushed it off. "Wait a minute, you misunderstand. We just need to make sure he doesn't come home for one night. That's all." "Well, that's another matter. What are you suggesting?" asked Grigory. "I'm not sure. Do you have contacts with the services?" "Unfortunately, not anymore," replied Grigory. "Ah, damn it," Mikhail said disappointedly, scratching the back of his head. "Maybe we could, just scare him?" suggested Grigory. "I thought of that too, but it's risky. He might wake up early, and you might overdo it." "Aya? You don't know me very well. I always do everything in moderation," Grigory said smugly. "You can't argue with that." But still, Mikhail hesitated. "I have an idea. I'll make sure he doesn't come home until morning, so don't worry," Grigory assured him. "I knew I could count on you," Mikhail said gratefully. "You don't have to flatter me. Just tell me when and where to start. And like an old friend, bring me up to speed," Grigory asked. Mikhail briefly but obsessively informed Grigory of his intention to detain Pavel and the reasons for it. Then he scrupulously outlined his plan to return from work, specifying the time and route. He asked Grigory to suggest how to provoke Pavel, to which Grigory responded uncertainly and questioned the need for provocation. Mikhail explained that they were going to provoke Pavel for their own safety, suggesting that it would be to Pavel's advantage if he initiated the conflict himself. They finished their conversation and went home. Mikhail entered the couple's house and saw Anastasia cooking at the stove. She turned and smiled welcomingly at him. "Were you at the negotiations?" she asked. "Yes, I had a few work issues to take care of," replied the guest. Anastasia turned to the stove and inquired how everything went. "Everything went smoothly, only there were some small problems," Mikhail replied. "Look, I think I saw Pavel a few minutes ago." The young man lied. Anastasia replied a little disappointed. "Really? Maybe they let him go early," Michael continued, I can't say for sure, but he was with a girl. Anastasia asked, What do you mean with a girl? Are you sure? That's what I'm saying. Maybe, Michael replied. Anastasia then asked where he had seen them. I stopped to eat at a cafe, and he was coming out of the diner across the street. I thought he might have stopped and had lunch there. I couldn't mistake him, because I was sitting on the veranda across the street. Michael explained. Pavel doesn't have a car, so he couldn't have stopped by. Michael continued, but they went out, talking loudly and laughing. Then the girl got behind the wheel, and Pavel got in the passenger seat. After that, they drove away. Anastasia expressed her concern. It's strange. First, his sudden work on weekends, which is unusual, and now this incident. I had a strange feeling when he mentioned work, but I didn't pay much attention to it. If it was really him, then everything becomes understandable. Mikhail tried to comfort Anastasia. Come on, don't jump to conclusions. If he said it works, then it does. I could be wrong. After all, I'm only human. He approached her reassuringly, placing his hands on her shoulders. And what if it isn't true? You said yourself that a mistake is unlikely. Anastasia sighed disappointedly. Mikhail put his arm around her reassuringly, allowing her to rest her head on his shoulder. Don't worry. Even if it's true, we still don't know all the details. There's no need to get upset ahead of time. Everything will work itself out. Anastasia started to worry after hearing something that alarmed her. However, she was also relieved. If what she had heard was true, it meant that the guilt and shame of her growing feelings for Michael in front of Paul might no longer be necessary. She almost believed this information, which made her feel deeply vulnerable. In her moment of weakness, she craved affection and support, and the only person she could rely on was Michael. Like a child, she sought comfort from him, resting her head on his shoulder while he stroked her hair and whispered soothing words. Eventually, she gathered the strength to leave his embrace and continue cooking. It will be ready soon, Nastia said to Michael, silently chiding herself for her vulnerability. You can go to your room. I'll call you later. Okay, the guest agreed and left the kitchen. For the rest of the day, Nastia pondered how she would tell Paul what she had heard. When her husband came home, exhausted and in a bad mood as usual, he was silent all evening. Nastia sniffed his clothes discreetly, but they smelled only of deodorant. And although she really wanted to ask him about it, she realized that bringing it up would start a conversation about Michael, and that scared her. Surprisingly, she did not feel jealousy, only a blow to the ego and a hidden resentment. Pavel's silent and indifferent behavior hurt her, and she explained it by the fact that he was fed up with her and everything in the house. Based on Michael's account of what had happened, she felt both anger and resentment. Nevertheless, despite her emotions, she decided to remain silent and wait until the guest left to resolve the matter. On Sunday morning, Paul woke up feeling as anxious as the day before. Each day seemed worse than the last, and despite the fact that Anastasia and their guest tried to hide their behavior, Paul sensed that something was wrong. Anastasia's sudden affection for him seemed forced, as if she was trying to remove all his doubts about her and their guest. Without eating breakfast or saying a word, Pavel left the house upset and headed to work. Usually in such situations, Anastasia would stop him, talk to him, and find out what was bothering him. This time, however, anger and disgust prevented her from doing so. She deliberately treated him with indifference. Throughout the day, Anastasia was unusually affectionate with Michael, and he reciprocated her affection. They played, laughed, and sometimes found themselves in each other's arms. But Anastasia quickly pulled away, feeling awkward, and returned to her previous behavior. In the evening, Mikhail went outside to check on Grigory and see if everything was all right. Grigory assured him that everything was fine, which helped Mikhail to calm down. When the workday was over, Pavel left the factory. Just a few minutes ago, he had been arguing with his boss about his paycheck and workday. He didn't want to make any concessions and threatened to quit if things stayed the same. The boss was annoyed that many employees had already left, but he didn't show it. He simply claimed that things would get better and Paul's salary would eventually increase. This was not the first time Paul had heard this, and he ran out of the office feeling heated. All day Pavel had been thinking about his relationship with his wife. Now he was sure that he would no longer remain silent, and like a real man, would deal with the situation. What had seemed to him a mere prejudice before, now looked like a harsh reality. As darkness fell and the streetlights turned off, Paul had to walk through the dimly lit yards. Suddenly someone called out to him. "Hey, kid," Pavel called out, looking around the neighborhood but finding no one. Shrugging his shoulders, he continued on his way. "Are you deaf?" came the voice again, this time closer. Paul turned around and saw two figures appearing out of the darkness. He stopped, with a look of obvious impatience on his face as he waited for their approach. "Do you have a cigarette?" one of them asked. "No, I don't smoke," Paul replied calmly, ready to move on. However, they didn't let him go so easily. "Are you sure?" they asked insistently. "Why all these questions?" "I already told you I don't smoke," Paul replied, a note of irritation in his voice. "Then you can go," they agreed. Paul turned on his heel and continued on his way, but he was quickly called out. "Listen, is that your mother working at the store next door?" mocked one of them, malice in his words. Paul felt a burning sensation in his chest, but gathered his strength to ignore the provocation and continue on his way. "Oh, she thought she was so important, did she?" "Because of your father, a thief who thought he could get away with anything because of his connections in the administration. Life has a funny way of balancing things out, buddy. Luckily, your ancestors have a special place waiting for them in the afterlife." They mocked loudly. Realizing that they were trying to provoke him, Paul couldn't take it anymore. He turned around and started walking toward them. "It's working," one whispered to the other as Paul approached. "What do you want from me?" he asked, anger cutting through his voice. "From us? We don't need anything. We just wanted to smoke. But instead you probably ran to your Jewish daddy, who had plenty of time to ruin our lives too. And that mother of yours, what a bore she was. She wanted to kick my parents out of the neighborhood street because they were competition. Well, look at things now, buddy. Your parents should have gotten what they deserved a long time ago." They spat. "Shut your mouth," Paul hissed, clutching the throat of one of them tightly. "No, my friend, it is your mouth that will be shut," the other replied before delivering a powerful blow to Paul. The young man collapsed under the force of the blow and fell to the ground. Gregory and his accomplice approached him, beating him mercilessly on every part of his body except his face. Suddenly, a shot rang out nearby. The attacker stopped, looking around, but saw nothing. "Halt!" came a voice from the darkness. Grigory's partner and himself froze, raising their heads and seeing a figure running towards them. "What do you want?" asked Grigory, approaching the man. The savior pointed his gun at one of the attackers. Realizing that resistance was futile, the partners turned around and ran away. The mysterious man did not pursue them, preferring to focus on the wounded victim. Paul lay on the ground, immobile, and the only sign of life was his labored breathing. "Alive," the middle-aged man muttered to himself. "Can you get up?" he asked Paul. Paul didn't answer, but slowly began to make attempts to rise. The man gently took him by the armpits and helped him to his feet. "You're in over your head. Lean on me." "I'd live in that building over there," the rescuer said, pointing to the nearest 5-story building. "My wife," Pavel moaned. "What's wrong?" Paul began digging through his pockets with his free hand, finally pulling out a cell phone and holding it out to the man. "Text my wife. Let her know I'll be late. Please." "How much longer are we going to wait for him?" protested Anastasia, sitting down on the couch next to Mikhail. "This is very strange. He said he'd be here earlier." The guest pretended to sympathize. "I think I know what this is about. You were probably right when you saw him with the other girl," Nastia pronounced, trying to hold back tears. "Well, Nastia, what are you thinking of?" said Mikhail softly, putting his arm around her. "There may be a lot of work." "What kind of work, Mish?" "He never works on Sundays. He even comes back earlier on weekdays," Nastia replied skeptically. "I know, but surprises happen," Mikhail explained. "Wait, I just got a text," Nastia said, suddenly reviving and grabbing her phone. "It's from Pavel. Honey, I'm going to be late." Go to bed without me. What does it mean? I'll call him right away. Seeing the message from Pavel, Mikhail was worried because he shouldn't have sent it. However, he remembered that Grigory had already mentioned some idea and calmed down. It's probably nothing, Nastya said tearfully. Don't worry, Nastya. Everything will be all right. Mikhail consoled her. I never thought. Nastya began, unable to finish her thought. Don't talk, Nastya, just cry. I'm there for you, and if I were your husband, I would never do anything like this. Mikhail comforted her. Thank you, Nastya managed to say through her tears. But you're not in his shoes. But I know you, and I can't understand how someone could do such a mean thing to you. You don't deserve this pain, Mikhail said sincerely. Anastasia moved closer to Mikhail, rested her head on his shoulder, and wiped her tear-drenched cheeks with her palms. We need to calm down, Nastya finally said. Mikhail looked at her affectionately, and when she felt her breath, she lifted her head and was a few centimeters from his face. Both of them hesitantly leaned in, closing their eyes, and kissed. Shit, Grigory muttered under his breath, moving away from the scene of the beating. He pulled out his cell phone and tried to call Mikhail, but couldn't get through. He desperately wanted to warn him of what had happened, but he had no other means of communication. Eventually, the man he rescued reached his first-floor apartment. They helped him remove his outer clothing and led him into the room, laying him gently on the sofa. The beaten Pavel could hardly move, feeling pain in almost all parts of his body. His torso ached and his head was splitting, although he could not see the extent of the beating. Undressing, the man walked over to Paul and lifted him slightly, beginning to strip him of his clothes down to his waist. Please bear with us, we need to examine you, the man said. Paul's torso was covered in red and blue bruises, and noticeable hematomas had appeared. Whenever the man touched the sore spot and Paul flinched in pain, it confirmed his suspicions. 2 ribs are definitely broken. Does it hurt you to breathe? The man asked. It's hard to breathe, Paul replied quietly. Are you a doctor? No, but I have some knowledge. We should call an ambulance, the man suggested. No, please, Paul whispered, grabbing the man's arm. I need to go home. I can't go to the hospital. That's not possible. You need immediate medical attention. You won't be able to make it home, the man insisted. I beg you, don't call an ambulance, Paul pleaded. There could be damage to your internal organs. This cannot be delayed, the man said sternly. Paul shook his head and tried to sit up. Please help me, he pleaded. The man gently lifted Paul to make it easier for him to sit up. It'll be better this way, but we have to go to the hospital right away, the man said. No, I need to go home, Paul continued to insist. Well, that's your choice. But at least I'll bandage your ribs, the man said. Thank you, Paul whispered in thanks. As the man began to bandage Paul's wounds, the man asked, So why did this happen? And as the man continued his work, Paul quietly and with a groan recounted the events that led up to the beating. But this is stupid, exclaimed the man. What do you mean stupid? Asked Paul, confused. There seemed to be no adequate response to their actions. What's the use of paying attention to such nonsense? It doesn't do any good. If someone from the outside decides to insult your values, it is better to ignore them. Otherwise, things will only get worse. Are you really your own worst enemy? What about honor? Who do you have to prove anything to? These people were brought up in an environment where they can't be changed. They may not be without intelligence, but they can't be fixed. There's no point in getting angry or resentful towards them. It's all the result of their upbringing, and it's often not their fault. The man reprimanded, expressing his thoughts. I recently lost my parents, and I will not tolerate anyone insulting them, Paul interrupted. Such principles only lead to decline and collapse. Bear with me a little longer. Bear with me. It doesn't. One senses intent. They wanted revenge, but I don't know why. When the bandaging was finished, Paul struggled to stand up, but he managed it. Breathing heavily, he shifted his feet and held his side with his left hand. A man stood behind him, watching his every move carefully and ready to lend a hand at any moment. Shouldn't we call an ambulance? No, It would be better if you gave me your contact information." The man slipped the business card into Paul's pants pocket, then helped him get dressed and down the stairs. "Thank you," Paul said goodbye. "Think twice next time." The young man hurried home, anticipating meeting his wife. His mind was swarming with thoughts of what he would say to her. Everything had been weighing on him lately, and Paul's moral sense had deteriorated. He was eaten up by longing and severe physical pain, and he longed to find comfort in Nastenka's presence and let his tears flow. He had promised himself that he would be strong and protect Nastya, but now he felt ready to break that vow. The memory of Mikhail filled him with anger. The intruder was annoying him, and Paul was determined to remove him from the house, no matter how impolite and inappropriate it seemed. As Paul walked down the street, his irritation grew. Every inch of his body ached, his breathing was labored, and his legs struggled to carry him forward. "I have to see Nastya right away, no matter what it costs me," Paul whispered, forcing himself to say the words through the pain. As he approached their house, he noticed that Mikhail's car was still parked nearby, a clear sign of his presence. This only increased Paul's bitterness. Paul entered the house in silence, trying not to disturb Mikhail and avoid the possibility of overhearing their conversation with his wife. Walking slowly to the bedroom, he opened the door and was startled by what he saw. Nastya lifted her head from Mikhail's firm chest, looking fearfully at her husband. "Pash, let me explain," she begged. Paul remained silent, his mind clouded, and without saying a word, he limped toward the bedroom. In a fit of anger, he smashed the bottom shelf of the dresser, scattering its contents. Anastasia and Mikhail watched in bewilderment as he unwrapped a tightly wrapped object in his hands. It was a gun. Without hesitation, he pointed the barrel at Mikhail. A single shot echoed through the room. The guest collapsed to the floor, unable to utter a sound. Nastya froze, gripped by terror, covering her mouth with her hands. "Monster," Paul whispered, pointing the gun at his wife. "Please don't," she pleaded. Another shot rang out. Anastasia fell to her knees, staring pleadingly at her husband. A few seconds later, she collapsed, letting out her last breath. Pavel gently put down his weapon, his realization of what just occurred slowly sinking in. Standing motionless, he gazed at his wife, blood staining the room. With a pensive expression in his wide, open eyes, he remained rooted in place. Gradually, he broke away from the devastating scene and made his way towards the exit. Exiting onto the porch, he raised his head to the sky, briefly contemplating before lowering it once more. In the next moment, a final gunshot pierced the air.